But I have a special guest here. So after sampling a short demo in London, I knew that two-man collective called Broken Fence Games, they need to come here to Žilina and share this mesmerizing experience with you. So I'll give you Matt and Eliott, and they will tell you everything about the game that's called A Lighting Course.
Hey, as Paul said, I'm Eliott and this is Matt, and we're here from Broken Fence Games. We're a small indie game development company based out of the UK, and we're going to talk about our game, our first game, A Lighting Course, which we've been working on for about 4 years now. So the game is a first-person adventure that we're rendering completely with particle systems. We've been completely unfunded until last year, when we were awarded a grant from the UK Games Fund, which is like a government body, that's really enabled us to push the game forward. In the game, you assume a role of an alien entity that discovers a time capsule in the form of a record player. And the record contains images and sounds of Earth, and is based on the real-life golden record that NASA sent with the Voyager program in the late 1970s. And those were a couple pictures of the actual disc. So the idea is that the player is exploring this ruined version of Earth in the far future, where it's been consumed by a great flood, and everything is underwater. And so you have to play back different parts of the record to reconstruct these memories of Earth. So we wanted to share with you some of the story of our development so far. What some of our motivations and influences have been, and why it's taken us so long to reach this point. Because where we ended up is much different from where we started. And we've changed direction several times over development. It's also important to note that we've never made a big game before. Our backgrounds are in fine art, not game design. But we think coming from outside of the game space is really valuable, and it makes us extra appreciative to be here. So thanks again for inviting us. So this flexibility and a willingness to be influenced from things outside of games is a positive and productive strategy, we think. And it's become something of a guiding principle that's emerged out of this project. And I think it adds to the strange character of what we're trying to create. So my part of the talk is going to focus on the visual style of the game and the ways that it's influenced the design. So starting out, I don't think we really realized how difficult everything was going to be. We knew the art style was beautiful and it seemed ripe for new styles of interactions. We had this blank canvas to kind of define our own visual language. But there's no best practice for how to build a game that looks like this. No instruction manual, and we've had so many opportunities to fail. Half of the battle has just been trying to hone in on the parts of the aesthetic we wanted to use. The difficulty has always been there's been too much choice. That the process has been one of accumulating as many ideas and mechanics as we can before knowing what we wanted to take away and use. There's so much scope. So it's been a process of deep exploration of the aesthetics of point clouds, and to make this a playful and enjoyable part of the game itself, so that players might be surprised by new ways of looking at familiar forms. So these are some of the LiDAR and sonar scans of shipwrecks that were the inspiration for the project. And there's like an inherent eeriness to them, something about how much the look relies upon absence and negative space. From early on, there's this desire then to make something where you'd have very few frames of visual reference. We wanted to create a real feeling of disbelief in the player and describe the world in a way that seemed to make the familiar strange, kind of as a way of putting you in this alien's frame of mind. And I think there's something, oops, there you go. I think there's something really powerful in the feeling of the uncanny that comes out of not quite understanding how something is constructed, and this really works in our favor with this game, in establishing a mood and an atmosphere. But looking elsewhere, I've always been struck and frustrated by the scenery of big blockbuster games. They strive for some kind of realism or believability, but the harder they try, the more they seem to fail. The sense of being somewhere else, which is a huge part of these games for me, falls apart on closer inspection, as all is revealed as carefully constructed set. I find it kind of perverse even that in these circumstances you're punished for looking closer, because the harder you look, the further you're drawn from the illusion. Literally, the closer you look, the less real these worlds become. Textures get blurry, edges don't align, and something breaks in your suspension of disbelief. But I don't mean to pick on Grand Theft Auto. But it's this pursuit of an unattainable ideal of infinite realism and detail which seems foolish. You can see it in the release of remastered versions of games to diminishing returns. I wonder if it might be more productive then to acknowledge this and go in the other direction. One of the really appealing things of point clouds comes, for me, from this desire to create something that, on closer inspection, breaks down gracefully. Not because of some super high resolution we are providing, but from the fact that from the very start, it relies on the viewer's imagination and memory to fill in those gaps. You provide the high res. It's incredible that even when you take away most of the points, the objects kind of still feel like they're there. When you acclimatize the eye to a lack of detail, the brain steps up a gear, works harder to fill in the blanks. As a viewer and a player, you're forced to bring more to the table, to become an active participant in painting the scene as you play it. It's a technique you can also see that benefits pixel art, which shines in this very lack of detail, in what it leaves the viewer to imagine. In this shot from Sword and Sorcery Super Brothers, there's so much information being conveyed just by the movement of single pixels. And it's amazing to me how expressive this can be. We're able to intuit so much from so little. And I think it boils down to the fact that we're pattern-seeking creatures. And when given limited information, we're always going to fill in the blanks. So with this in mind, we can ask ourselves, what are the fundamental qualities of the materials we're using within our game? And how might they be best applied? So the two main components of our art style are A, everything is made of dots, and B, the dots are blended additively. So this means that when we layer up lots of dots, they get brighter, they accumulate light. And this leads to some interesting side effects in how we eventually end up showing objects on the screen. So this is a sphere that we've randomly placed points across the surface of it. But without moving around it, it's really hard to tell that it's a round three-dimensional object. But if we just add some more points, we start to see the first practical use for that additive blending. It gives us shape and shading around the edges of the sphere. And we can see this with many objects. They take on the glow around their silhouette because we are looking through the most layers of points in those places. We still may have a problem in judging depth though. If I was to pause this video and pick a point on the hand, I'd be pretty hard pressed to tell you whether it was at the front or the back. So we needed a way to shade and give more shape to our objects. But how can you do that without surfaces? The answer emerges again from the additive properties of the points. So instead of changing the color values, like in this example where the points are going from dark to light, we can change instead their positions, their density and space, to create the effect of shading and shape. So as we put more points in one area, that area will get brighter, and less than that area will seem darker, but actually all of these points have the same value in terms of color. And it's this kind of our inversion of an engraver's hatching pattern, where the more tightly packed the marks become, the darker the area gets. But in our case, adding more points to an area does the reverse and brightens it, like the road markings in this next slide. It also shares something with the way that dithering works, where gradations in value are achieved by introducing noise into a more limited palette. So we use this effect too by fuzzing the position of points. And this kind of simulates light wrapping around the surface and gives the impression of a more realistic lighting. So with more complex objects though, it can become difficult to tell still what's protruding and what's receding, and it's kind of like that famous hollow mask illusion. So to minimize this, we started just lighting things from one direction. This makes it easier to determine depth, but it also tends to make things look really, really dramatic. And stylistically, it's not dissimilar to this technique that was used in a lot of Baroque painting called tenebrism. So he was a Caravaggio, he used it quite a bit. And it's the technique of pushing tonal contrast to the extreme, and you'd normally have your light coming from one or very few sources, and it really entices you into the image and draws your eye. But light plays a critical role in these paintings, thematically too, and it's highly symbolic. In the work of painter Joseph Wright especially, light is used to represent a new dawn of scientific and rational understanding. And Wright did a series of these paintings where light represented a kind of the frontier of science, and they were really the kind of poster images of the Enlightenment. So the light in his images is both entrancing and frightening. So from the beginning, there is something in this combination of dark negative space and using no polygonal surfaces that immediately drew us to revealing things from darkness. And as we've seen, the additive nature of the particles prevent us from drawing too far into the distance. So murkiness and mystery is a foundational and inbuilt part of this game. So one of the first ideas we explored was that the player, just like the environments, would be formed of points, and they could shape themselves into different forms to navigate and illuminate this largely invisible landscape. This was one of the first tests that I showed Matt when describing the game. It's a little sketchy, but you get the basic idea that you are this swarm, and you can momentarily assume a different shape, like a room in this case. Eventually, this translated into something playable, and this is a really early demo, where you could control the swarm moving across a landscape, and you'd be lighting up other bits, like these pink flowers here, as you went through. And we eventually moved on from this, but it was the first step towards thinking about using particles as a resource for the player that they have to collect and then manage. And it always seemed logical to us that since everything was made of points, that you would be kind of accumulating as you go through the game, and that we'd really be missing a trick if we didn't include this. So the idea was that the more points you had, then the more complex forms you'd be able to take. But while this seemed good in theory, it became apparent that using large numbers of particles actually made it really difficult to determine and track quantities even. Because it turns out the kind of small, definite increases in numbers that suit game progression are very difficult to track in these circumstances. So early on, we then tried to apply this effect to entire objects at once. I thought maybe that would work. So players could add or remove detail as one of their abilities in the game. Because objects are defined so heavily with negative space, though, it's really hard to give the impression to the player that they're ever reaching a complete state. Like the change has to be really dramatic and stark. And again, this kind of relates back to game rules tending to favor binary states. And just gradually increasing the level of detail doesn't really fit with this. Like, it's very easy to tell when there's no object there, but at any other point in that animation, it's hard to go like, yes, this object is finished. So we needed a different way of using points to communicate state changes. So the next thing we tried was just editing how they change density. So in this version, the points are kind of animated along the shape of the object. And this next slide is going to be just a lot of different examples of ways we were playing around with that. In this version of the game, you could swap different objects around, and depending on where you put them and what they were, they would affect and influence the level of detail around them, like in this case. But the problem with this is that it was really labor-intensive. The pattern that all of the shapes took and how they lit up had to be hand-authored, and it's usually specific to each object. But we were interested in disintegrating objects from a technical point of view too, and how it might influence just the performance of the game. So it seemed like a smart way of dealing with the old level of detail problem, where as objects recede into the background, you want to use lower polygon counts. And I actually think this is like a really great example of one of the ways in which you can make something that's normally a technical problem into an artistic choice. So I skipped over the transition from third to first person that we made, but looking back, it seems like a really obvious choice. This is one of the first tests we did with the first person, and it's some of the earliest footage we ever released. And the spaces just immediately seemed more real and strange when viewed from the perspective we normally see from. In hindsight, you kind of realize that third person with that swarm really played down the strengths of what we were working with. You know, it's not the kind of game where you just want to go around staring at the ground. But perhaps that's just a consequence of us being new to game design. So making this change definitely shifted our priorities towards working on more of the experiential side of things, on how the game felt to play. And it was during this time that we discovered one of the key things to selling your presence in these environments is giving the points movement, and that stillness is really an enemy here. Because it kind of otherwise looked like just objects that had this point texture draped around them. So we started giving everything this kind of faint undulating movement, and that would get stronger as you got nearer. And it was in making all these decisions that the idea of overlapping spaces started to come into play. So instead of these invisible structures that you'd be forming in third person, now there was an entirely different set of landscapes, and you were going to be traveling between them, but they were all actually located on top of each other. And we had this idea that the player would have to switch between them to achieve different things. And we tried all kinds of ways to make this happen. Like at one point we had these magic doors that were like portals that switched you between dimensional planes, or lampposts that you had to stand under, and when you stood under it, that showed you a part of a new world. Likewise, we had both been reading this Bruce Chatwin book, which is actually like a travel book, where he describes this Aboriginal way of mapping the landscape through song and music, where the rhythm and story come to represent features of the landscape. So in theory, you could be standing in what might be like a barren desert, but if you knew the right song, you could picture it differently, and suddenly this sort of like huge wilderness would become navigatable. And this is where the musical side of things kind of crept into our game, and we began to think of these different colored worlds we were making and lights as if they were each either their own song or part of a bigger song that you'd be trying to combine, like literally in chorus, as the objective of the game. And it seemed like this amazing and like surreal way of picturing the familiar. And it also chimed with an interest I had in psychogeography and situationist approach to walking the city, where, for example, you might superimpose the maps from two different cities on top of each other as a way of kind of like, to use a tech term, disrupt your route through a familiar space. But after months of trying all these things, they weren't coalescing together. There was just too many ideas to suit the visuals we wanted to use. Although one of the things that stayed was the kind of the motif of wilderness meeting the urban environment, and that's still there now. So overall, it's really exciting for us to think about our game space as being something more than just polygons. Objects presented in this way, have this ghost quality, and they lend themselves to being moved through rather than around. In fact, in earlier builds of the game, we made players walk through the title card to really try and bed that in. Rather unexpectedly, though, we found that most players still walked around things. They avoided walls or walked around objects, even with the choice to go through them. And we're so used to the rules of collision, even when we know they don't apply, we can't help but follow them. So we needed a new way to reinforce them, a new rule set that would have our own consistency. So then we started prototyping new ways to transform the space around you. And actually, it was one of the simplest things we tried that worked best. And that was just to hold a key down. And when you held it down, the world would change. And when you released it, everything would change back. Even in like this early form, the effect is really powerful. There's something about the springiness of that action that makes you appreciate the transience of these environments that we're creating. We just needed, at this point, a kind of narrative rationale. So first, we tried playing with the notion of a flooded world. You were going to be using like a time travel device to morph back into previous states. But it was hard to fit in all those other aspects of the game that we liked. And that's where eventually Voyager came in. It seemed like the perfect way to wrap all of these ideas up. It was inherently musical. Both visual and sound were encoded on that disc. And it made sense that it was something temporary and incomplete. Holding down a key to play it back made some sense. And if you were playing as an alien, the theme of pattern recognition, which is what the visual style is all about, is matched so well with the act of trying to decipher the contents of this artifact of Earth. It also gives us a rationale to mash up all of these in different environments. We can afford to make surreal and odd visual comparisons, because that's what the Golden Record itself was, this collage of sound and light. It even seemed to fit within a broader use of light as a motif in the arts, like we saw with Joseph Wright's painting of an orrery, the Voyager probe as an emitter of light, the pinnacle of human technology at the time they were produced. So using Voyager as a springboard has helped us immensely, and we're still working out a lot of things, but I hope you can try the demo just over there. I think I'll wrap up there. I'm going to pass over to Matt, who's going to now talk about the engine. So thanks.
Thanks, Eliott. Hi, so I'm Matthew. I'm a programmer on a lighting chorus. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about the engine, the process of creating it, and a little bit about its relationship to my art practice and thoughts on coding in general as a creative craft. So a lighting chorus runs in our own engine. It runs in C++ and OpenGL. Most of its gameplay is directed through directories of Lua scripts. The sound in the game runs with live effects through the Fmod API, and shading in the game is dependent on a bunch of GLSL shaders. So apologies if I'm talking down to anybody here. A shader is a program assigned to a series of particles that tells them each frame how they should render and behave. So here we have just a red shader attached to an object. It's just telling the object to code everything red, and has this kind of glitchy sort of effect based on the positions of the particles. As I moved the mouse, nothing really changed. It was the same kind of effect, but if I change the shader to its correct shader, not only is it aesthetically more pleasing, but now the behavior changes as we move the mouse towards the red note. You can see it kind of reverberating to the player, and it's going to be attracted to the player. So the shader is dictating something both about the aesthetics and the behavior of the particles. Outside of these core elements of the engine, we have many scripts and node networks that allow for the exporting of particles into the game. One of the interesting shortcuts that we choose in our workflow is rather than creating the assets in our own engine, we create the art in an external animation software, and we write a bunch of scripts to export that into the engine. Once the particles get into the engine, they're held in a bunch of OpenGL buffers. So a buffer is just a big container, a big array of information. And if we zoom in on our little infamous deer here, these points are all going to have information stored on them. Each one is in a little slot in this big container. The shaders I mentioned before will take this information each frame to determine the particle's behavior. This is more traditionally associated with vertices that determine polygonal shapes, but as almost everything you see is particles in our game, we use it for points. The geometry that we do use, we're either using for collision detection, so the floor and the walls here and the boundaries of the world, or we might use it for occlusion, or hidden objects that in some way react to the particles in the game. So I've described particles in the game as being points that are calling their shader program each frame. Part of that program that they share is a call to a texture. So if we take that call away and we just render all of the particles as sprites, the aesthetic looks something like this. I kind of like it, but it's slightly chaotic. And if we put the textures back on, oops. Oh, I guess it was at the end of this. Yeah, so we start out our sprites. If we turn the textures back on, it's going to go back to the more aesthetically pleasing. And just to be clear, the only thing that's changed here is that each point is now rendered with a circle with drop-off as a texture rather than just as a big white cube. So each frame, the engine needs to render millions of these particles, often split into multiple dimensions that the player can bring in and out of visibility as they affect the world. This is a big load on the engine. It doesn't like suddenly rendering a ton of new particles in a frame, so we have to have clever techniques to try to sort of preload a bunch of the particles and try to never suddenly tell it to render thousands of new objects. Here we see the player shifting from the ghostly kind of underwater space to this vibrant green forest scene. One of the really interesting aspects of developing a world made out of particles is that an object is only ever defined by the points and the colors that make it up. So as we can slowly change these positions and colors, we can really seamlessly morph from one state to another, and morphing is something that we've constantly utilized during the game. We do this through two main techniques, either through blending or through transform feedback. If I go back to my MS Paint example, blending would just be interpolating between two of these bits of information, like the source pos and the goal pos, for example, whereas transform feedback would be actually doing some simulation each frame and recording that into the buffers and saying, this is a new bit of data that is stored within that buffer. That's closer to traditional particle simulation. So between Eliott and I think we have a really unique set of tools that we've created for the project, which gives us a lot of low-level control and the ability to experiment in ways that wouldn't be possible with an off-the-shelf engine. There are also some costs to this independent style, and I'll talk about those a little bit. The main cost, I would say, is time. We've been working on Light and Chorus for around 4 years, and some of the concepts and engine code stretch back a lot further. We're often asked when the game will be finished, and while I think we have a really clear vision for the project, it's kind of hard to answer while so many of the technical and conceptual aspects are evolving. I understand this is really undesirable in a saturated games market, but I'd like to argue that this investment of time and energy, to the extent that it's spent learning new skills and understanding, has intrinsic value, akin to the thousands of hours that any other artist might spend cultivating their craft, be it developing a writing practice or a painting technique. Of course, intrinsic value doesn't always pay the bills. I fell in love with programming as a kid when, with our first computer, my mom had this software called Click and Play, game-making software. Game-making software is a tiny bit generous. That's about the best kind of game you could create with it, I would say. Didn't really have any programming in it, but what it did have is this event editor that allowed the player to create relationships between user input and events within the game. It was asking the question, okay, I'm a new frame, what should I do now? And I'd spend hours making these convoluted animations of coins, spelling out certain kinds of words or triggering noises or whatever. There's always been something really magical to me about programming as a creative craft, especially if it produces something visual. There's something about this relationship between words on a page and complex sensual systems being so intertwined. This is one of my degree show pieces where I'm trying to create a kind of a pseudo-biological simulation. So it has both code, it has this side of it that's trying to show you how it's simulating, and then it has the kind of aesthetic shading of the object. And all of these different states of the system, kind of different sides of the same coin. When I started learning C in my 20s, I remember this excited feeling of little visual explosions reacting to small changes in code, and it's still a feeling I get when tiny little differences allow a collision system to finally work, and instead of the player flying off into infinity or collapsing into the floor, they kind of explore a hill in a satisfying way. I think that creativity is often thought of as this very abstract thing, maybe that an artist is either talented or not, and all this talent kind of exists somewhere within them, just waiting to jump out. But I think of creativity as having more to do with making adjustments to the parameters that we understand within a system. And those adjustments themselves often don't feel that inspired. They feel like making little adjustments to what we understand. What happens if I make this character in my novel more significant, or I axe the bass from this song, or I apply this piece of philosophy to this new question. A great shortcut here is collaboration, especially between people who have complementary skills or different domains of expertise or different ways of thinking. As an example of increased design choices, if our depth of control of sound is attaching sound files, then we can either choose to play that sound or not play the sound. We can choose to raise the volume. We might choose a different file. But if we have to design the sound engine ourselves and expose a lot of new parameters, or even if we use an API that gives us a lot of new parameters, we can choose to, I don't know, hook up the frequency to something that the player is doing. We can choose to experiment and create our own sounds. Here we have the player interacting with objects in a kind of musical way. I don't know how easy that is to hear. So sound in this example moves from something of a black box that we can use or not use with some parameters set by someone else, to an area of inquiry, an exploration of a new medium that might stimulate ideas we could never have expected. Realistically, there's always going to be a black box at some place in the system, a level of machine language or computational lifting that we don't really care to understand, maybe. I'm not inclined to judge where anybody else has these unknowns in their system. I'm personally not too worried about making my own programming language, for example. But I do think that, as I mentioned, it's really important to be involved in the creation of, or at least the understanding of, as many different elements of a system as possible. The flip side of this is, as more elements come under our creative control, there's an increasing potential for bugs and strange architecture. I'm confident that an off-the-shelf engine would be easier to debug in most cases anyway, but we can be pretty confident that the solution to a week-long bug, some kind of crisis we're having, isn't a ridiculous typo by the programmers of a Unity, for example. As I mentioned, I'm self-taught as a programmer. Working on my own engine opens up these interesting cases where I feel at the limit of my understanding. Perhaps not being sure if a problem has a solution, or at least it starts to become harder and harder to find online support as tasks become more specific to our project. It can feel like I'm walking through the unknown, searching for something that I'm not sure exists. But that also seems like the most exciting and unusual adventures. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions for me and Eliott, please ask. You can ask us now, or you can ask us later. And thank you very much to Pavel and Pastor Anča in general for inviting us.
So if you have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll pass the mic. No questions? Oh, okay, there you go.
So, hello, thank you for your great speech. I liked everything about it. And in the beginning of the presentation, Eliott talked about that your main focus was fine art or visual art. My question is, if there's if your project is strictly audio-visual experience, or if you're trying to comment or something, or if you try to tell us some story, or if there's something behind these great visual style art.
Yeah, I think Eliott would be better to answer that than me.
Yeah, so the question was how much of a story there is, or is that right?
Basically, yes.
What's that?
Yes, if there's some backstory, or if you're trying to tell something with your visual,
Right.
with this visual experience,
Yeah.
or if it is strictly like a visual thing.
Sensory kind of thing. I would say it's a mix of both. We do, you know, there will be an end to the game, and there is a kind of narrative that you progress through, but it's really abstract. We're hoping you kind of piece it together without us spoon feeding it, maybe in a like more traditional narrative game sense. So we're trying really hard not to use any words, and just let you kind of like try and figure out what's going on. And you know, I would say that like the history of developing this game is just one of lots of failure, and that's one of the biggest. But yes, there will be a story eventually, and hopefully it will make more sense than what's playable over there.
I think at the risk of sounding a little bit pretentious, we also think that the audio-visual, the kind of sensory processing that you're doing is telling some kind of a story, like we're giving a really unusual experience to the player, and it's not like there's the story isn't so detached from the ways in which you're experiencing your environment. If that makes any sense.
All right. Any other question? All right.
Just simple one. Maybe you already said at time. Is that what's your plan with the game when it's out? What platforms, and do you plan to promote it and work with it later?
Yeah, I don't think we can give a definitive answer on that. We can roughly say about a year, we're hoping, but even that, like, don't hold us to anything like this. We would definitely be releasing on PC. That's what we're developing for. Steam, right?
Steam,
yeah. Humble, yeah. It's possible that we could port to consoles, but these are things that we can't really say right now.
You know, our team is just us two, so we're really just focusing on getting like just the PC version done, and then we'll see how it does, and you know, if we can afford to keep working on this.
Another question? Maybe one last. Okay, I will ask. How much of replayability is in the game? Can you finish it in one go and then you explore everything, or there is something that you can explore more when you're paying attention more to the environment?
I mean, eventually we would like it to be that there's a lot of potential for you to kind of miss stuff. Definitely that's the case in how we're like implementing all of the mechanics, because a lot of the stuff we don't tell you about, so it's kind of a process of like you click a button and something happens and you're like, ooh, I wonder what this means, and if I go back there and did this thing, what would happen there? So yeah, in the final version, hopefully a little bit of replayability, yeah.
All right, thanks. Okay, thank you guys.
Thanks.